Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
Luciana was sitting in a small cafe. There were few people. The weather outside was pleasantly warm, with small white caps of snow left in some places. Luciana felt out of place since the morning. She had a little argument with her father, who, as always, was in a bad mood. Lately, when problems arose in the business, Constantino Rivas became unbearable. He had a disgusting quality: he would lash out at those closest to him. Unpleasant words said by her father kept popping up in Luciana's mind. Each time she remembered them, an unpleasant feeling welled up in her chest. When her father would cool off a bit, he would always call, apologize, and offer some kind of peace offering. Her father solved all problems in life with money, gifts, and envelopes full of cash, even when it came to his own daughter. Julia rushed into the cafe, waving both hands at her friend. She was wearing a black coat that she loved so much. The girl carefully took it off to avoid creases, hung it on a tall hanger, and then headed to her friend's table. "The weather is just wonderful. Spring is almost here," Julia said cheerfully. "And you won't believe it, but Eugene proposed to me." "Really? Congratulations!" Luciana almost exclaimed in surprise. "Oh, I don't even know if I should be congratulated. I don't know if I should say yes to him. He's somehow, unpromising. He works in his company, and he'll just sit there, won't even get a promotion. Why would I need such a guy? I want a good life. But living paycheck to paycheck just because the guy is lazy," Julia said, rolling her eyes. "How did you suddenly realize that he's unpromising? He's still very young." "Maybe he has everything ahead of him," Luciana said. Julia shook her head negatively. She took a large cup of coffee, took a bite of a pastry, and closed her eyes. "That's the thing, he's young. Pay attention, all the guys who were simple workers in their childhood, they stay that way. And then their kids finish regular school, unlikely to go to college because their parents can't afford a decent education," Julia said, rolling her eyes. "I didn't find myself in a dump. I'm not a silly Barbie to throw myself at any guy." "Well, I don't know. I think Eugene is a good guy. He loves you." "Lucia, what's the point? What's the point of his love? Love eventually ends, he'll run off to some other girl, and I'll be left with a child in poverty. You should use your head when getting married, so you don't regret later that your whole life went down the drain," Julia said firmly. Luciana shrugged, as she saw no point in giving advice. She felt that their conversation had dragged on. Luciana leaned back in her chair and looked at her friend. Julia just smiled. The conversation between them continued for another hour, but the topic had changed. Luciana was still going over the conversation with her friend in her head. When she came home in the evening, she briefly told her father about the content of their discussion. To her surprise, Senor Rivas supported Julia. "She's right. From childhood, they show you on TV that love conquers all, and then we have a bunch of 30-year-old women with children in their arms, all alone, with an absolute belief that all men are scoundrels. It doesn't work like that. You should choose a person for marriage primarily based on their qualities. And love. Love is something we build after infatuation. You can create it with your own hands," said Senor Rivas. "And how can you live without love?" Luciana asked. "Lucia, what is marriage, relationships anyway? People find each other to continue their lineage, to make life easier. Shared life, mutual support, assistance, the desire to find a kindred soul with whom you can go through thick and thin. And believe me, you can have all of that without the so-called infatuation. But such a marriage will stand the test of time, unlike your infatuation. Young people are just naive, don't understand anything," Senor Rivas said. Luciana just rolled her eyes. Her father laughed when he saw her reaction, awkwardly patted her on the shoulder, and then sat down opposite her. "You should choose a husband who will make life easy for you, so you can live for yourself and give him love, rather than turning into a domestic servant who has to do everything. You're the daughter of a millionaire, don't forget that. Julia is right, listen to her words. I wouldn't agree either if you decided to marry an ordinary guy. Wealthy people are different, they have a different mentality, education, social circle, horizons. And some Johnny from the village. Well, let him marry his milkmaids, Senor Rivas said. Luciana decided not to dwell on this topic anymore. She nodded at her father's words, but still held her own opinion that love exists and is important. Soon, her father went to his office, and Luciana stayed at the table. She kept going over Julia's words in her head, and then her father's statements. It felt like they had conspired, even though her father didn't particularly like Julia after they first met. But maybe there was something in what they were saying. Luciana pushed her cup aside, leaned forward to cut a piece of cake. The door opened, and a bell rang. Luciana knew that one of her father's partners was supposed to arrive any minute now. Eduardo entered the house, looking around the expensive interior with a critical eye. Luciana straightened up at his audacity, staring straight at him. Eduardo lowered his eyes. The tall, slim man in a suit looked out of place here. Luciana couldn't stand it when her father invited partners home. He would mention it in advance to avoid scaring his daughter, but she still didn't like having strangers in the house. Hello. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Eduardo Silva. I'm your father's partner. The man extended his hand. His palms were well-groomed, shining and glistening. It was clear that this person had never even held a rag in his hands. Luciana shrugged slightly, as if flexing her muscles. She extended her hand for a handshake. Eduardo turned her palm, kissed it immediately, and smiled. There was something unpleasant about his smile. She felt like he was a predator, and she was the infamous prey. Your father didn't tell me how beautiful you are, Eduardo said, using a worn-out phrase. Maybe because I'm not a pedigreed dog? Maybe he just didn't boast about me to everyone. You have character, Eduardo said and laughed. Luciana wanted to grab him by the lapels, drag him out of the house, and never let this person in again. Eduardo let out a few oily, unpleasant jokes that he found funny. Luciana didn't react to them at all, which irritated him. Another pompous jerk, she didn't like such people. I think it's time for me to go. I hope we'll meet again, Eduardo said. Luciana nodded, waited for this man to climb the spiral staircase and disappear into the office. Finally, she could finish her meal peacefully, lost in thought. An elderly maid entered the kitchen, quickly collected the dishes for the dishwasher. My father is determined to marry me off. You know, like in the old village, he'd sell me for 100 sheep, Luciana said with a weary voice. Oh, come on now. Your father, of course, is a strict man, but he wishes you well. Times are different now, thank goodness. No one can force you into a marriage. Your father knows what he's talking about, you should listen to him. Do you also believe that it's not worth marrying for love? Luciana asked. Senora Ponce shrugged. She paused for a moment, adjusted her pristine white apron. I got married for love the first time. I loved the person so much that I couldn't catch my breath when I was around him. I did everything for him, built my whole world around him. I forgave everything. As they say, I was a wise woman. But he wiped his feet on me, found someone else, left me with a child in my arms. So, I ended up all alone with my love. The second time, I got married with a clear head. We've been living soul to soul for 20 years now. You should choose a partner with your head. The heart is blind, Senora Ponce said. My parents got married for love, Luciana said. Your mother was a wonderful person. A wonderful woman who could give your father a peace of mind, to put it bluntly. But your father was a worthy man too. Their love happened as a continuation of their choice to be together. Perhaps that's the ideal scenario, though who knows? I don't know a single couple who've lived in love for even 10 years. They either divorce after 3 years or endure each other as long as they have the strength or until the children grow up. Luciana didn't want to continue the conversation. She didn't want to further doubt the words she had in her head. She still wanted to get married for love and have everything turn out the way it should. Luciana looked through photos of her mother, constantly pondered whether her mother loved her father. Her mother had died a long time ago in an airplane accident that had led to a catastrophe. More than 10 years had passed. Luciana no longer cried when she thought of her mother, but her bright image still remained in her mind and before her eyes. By the time Eduardo descended the stairs, Luciana was getting ready to leave. She left an open book on the table. The man rudely picked up the book, looked at the cover, and chuckled. "Is something bothering you?" Luciana said quite directly. "I didn't think such a delicate lady would be into detective thrillers," Eduardo chuckled. "You should be reading something romantic." "Since when do I have to ask what to read?" "Don't get me wrong. I was just. This is not your house. And please allow me to read what I want in my own home. Take your head out of the 18th century. Nowadays, women can afford to do anything," Luciana replied bluntly. She climbed the spiral staircase and went to her room. She heard Eduardo stomping in the hallway, and then he simply left, slamming the door. Luciana couldn't stand opportunists in the house. She had talked to her father many times that it was not right. The longer these conversations dragged on, the more she thought that it was time to get her own place. Luciana was getting ready to meet her friend. She thought about her father's words. Lately, he had been talking a lot about her becoming part of the family, which meant she had to contribute in some way. By the way, she had no intention of getting involved in her father's business. She couldn't stand all those processes, offices, employees whose heads were constantly bent over monitors. Every time she thought about it, it made her uncomfortable. Luciana could work with animals, open a beauty salon, or create a chain of photography studios. She wanted to do something kind, creative, and enjoyable, but not a business that involved managing hundreds of people. In reality, Luciana often thought about returning to her mother's large house. It was located in a modern, large village about 100 kilometers from here. There was a special atmosphere there, different air, and different people. Moreover, the house stood completely alone. From time to time, her father would send a team there to clean and maintain it, so no matter when you arrived at the house, it was always clean, cozy, and well kept. Luciana could talk to her father, gather her things, and leave, but she knew he would be against it. Senor Rivas was most afraid that his daughter would inherit her mother's love for the land. Luciana herself didn't see anything wrong with that. She calmly dealt with plantings, repaired the greenhouse, and grew greens. But then her father just took her away from there, and she didn't have the courage to resist him. Now Luciana was old enough to make decisions independently, but every decision she made was accompanied either by financial rewards from her father or by punishments. If before Luciana was afraid of being left without her father's support, now she increasingly thought that it was the only way to gain freedom. By the time Luciana stepped into the hallway, her father was already waiting downstairs. It seemed as though he was waiting for her for a conversation, and she didn't like it at all. When her father had that look on his face, the conversation often ended in a quarrel. "Luciana, where are you going at this late hour?" her father said with a doubtful voice. "It's only 4 o'clock. "I have yoga in an hour," she said, shrugging. "I need to talk to you. Maybe we can chat in my office?" "Every time we talk in your office, I end up in trouble. You start a scene, threaten to cut off my finances, and I endure it," Luciana said calmly. "I'm a straightforward person, of course, but not as much as you describe. Lucia, let's go to the office quickly." "Just 15 minutes, I won't keep you longer." Luciana rolled her eyes, but still went up to the office. She knew that if she didn't agree to her father's conditions, there would be a scene downstairs. He was the kind of person who couldn't tolerate anything. Luciana was afraid of disappointing her father again because he could quickly put her in her place. What would it be this time? Forbid her to go to university? She had already changed her mind about that. Or would he say he wouldn't buy her the promised apartment? She would move into her mother's house, which belonged to her alone. Fortunately, her mother had taken care of that in advance. Whatever happened, Luciana always had her own corner where she could escape. "Did you meet Lalo?" the man asked. "Yes, another pompous jerk." "Is our conversation going to be about him?" "Honestly, Dad, I really don't want to dig into all of this. All these guys are exactly the same, born with a silver spoon in their mouths, and they think the world owes them," Luciana said. "As you grow older, you become more and more like your mother, stubborn, headstrong, sharp with words. Men won't marry someone like that," her father summed up. "We're not living in the Middle Ages when a daughter had to be married off. Maybe I won't get married at all. And by the way, why are we having this conversation? I want you to go on a date with him. He asked for my permission like a true gentleman, and I'm already curious about your opinion. Let me get this straight. Two grown men suddenly decided to dictate the life of a grown woman? Am I not a living person but a carpet to be sold?" Luciana exclaimed in amazement. "Luciana, I just want you to talk to him. If you get along, it will be good for the business. And if you end up getting married, this union will benefit both of us," her father said. Luciana stormed out of the office before he could start a new sentence with all his arguments. Luciana couldn't understand why she should obey her father's orders, let alone marry a man she found unpleasant. Just to be sure, she checked the calendar. Had she accidentally traveled a few hundred years back in time? Luciana went to yoga with her friend in a terrible mood. Inside, she was seething with anger. How could he make such a proposal? And if there was a normal guy, but this one? Luciana shuddered. She wanted to turn around, go back to her father's office, and give him a piece of her mind. Luciana walked down the long corridor of the sports center. She changed, participated in yoga, and it helped calm her down a bit. Today, Luciana promised to give Julia a ride home so she wouldn't have to call a taxi. Luciana was so angry that she spilled all the information to her friend in one breath. "So, does that mean he's really wealthy?" Julia asked. "Well, it's more like his parents are wealthy. Those who've earned their fortune never act like that," Luciana countered. "Maybe we could meet up together? Just spend some friendly time, have coffee, chat, and I'll take a look at him." "Luciana, I think you're being too biased towards him. When I first saw Eugene, he seemed like a complete idiot to me. Sometimes guys act completely foolish when they like a girl. Maybe he's sitting at home right now feeling like an idiot for recommending a different book to you. Maybe it's worth giving him a chance." Julia asked. "Oh, not you too," Luciana retorted. "Luciana, don't be angry with me. Finding a good, decent man these days. Oh God. Such men are scarce as the hen's teeth. They're all mama's boys who can't detach themselves from their mother's apron strings. Maybe your dad is right. Maybe he found you a worthy person. Call Eduardo right now and have him come over." Luciana looked around anxiously. Maybe she shouldn't rush things? The next day, she called Eduardo and suggested that he come to a cafe where she would be with her friend. Luciana felt out of place from the morning. They were supposed to meet at a restaurant decorated in a nautical theme, which seemed out of place. Luciana felt strangely uncomfortable. It was as if she had been plucked out of her usual life and placed in a silly comedic novel. Luciana took a deep breath and descended a few small steps. The hostess who greeted her led her to her table. Eduardo entered right after her, and then Julia rushed in. Luciana could tell from her friend's eyes that Julia found Eduardo attractive. But Luciana herself would have preferred to spend time somewhere else with a completely different person. "Well, ladies, let's have a drink to get acquainted," Eduardo said, breaking into a broad smile. Despite the overall smooth conversation, Luciana saw nothing but pretense in his words. He seemed pompous, artificial, all wrong. Luciana felt like she was next to him as if in a wax figure museum. Only, for some reason, this figure was talking and pretending to be a real person. Luciana wanted to get up and leave right now. This conversation made her nauseous. It was like riding in an old car over bumpy roads. Here, the day after tomorrow, we will definitely go to sign the contract. In general, I've always believed that I was literally born to be a businessman. This is just not for me, digging in the ground, dealing with manure, Eduardo said with disdain in his voice. I enjoy working in the soil, planting, harvesting, tending to greenhouses, and taking care of animals, Luciana said. Eduardo burst into laughter loudly. Luciana stared at him, not understanding what had caused such fun. Isn't it funny? A millionaire's daughter playing in the dirt, planting cucumbers in the morning, picking tomatoes, and collecting eggs in a dirty chicken coop, and in the evening, she's wolfing black caviar with a big spoon, Eduardo laughed. Luciana stood up. Only now did he realize that this was not a joke. His vanity and pomposity gave her every right to say goodbye and never see him again. She had given this man a chance. Nothing more was required from her. Where are you going? Wasn't that just a joke? Eduardo asked in astonishment. I'm saying goodbye to you, hopefully forever, Luciana replied rather rudely. She stormed out of the restaurant, not wanting to spend another minute there. She was tired of Eduardo and her friend, who was practically glowing, trying to impress him. Julia stayed at the restaurant. Apparently, she wanted to eat for free. Luciana wasn't interested in her motives. There would be a conversation between them anyway. When Luciana met Julia again, her friend apologized for staying at the restaurant. I just wanted to get to know him better to understand what kind of person he is and if it's worth giving him a chance. Well, I don't know. It didn't inspire me at all. I'm so tired, everything has been irritating me since morning. First, my father is brainwashing me, then I can't let myself live in peace. And now this Eduardo, Luciana replied sharply. You're right, he's completely wrong for you. You understand that sooner or later, you'll have to talk to your father about this? I only know your father indirectly. Besides, I know he doesn't like me much. But something tells me that if he's convinced of something, he needs to be sure of it. And if you twist the truth and don't tell him, it won't end well. The truth, Luciana, you need to decide when you'll definitely talk to him, Julia said. As much as Luciana didn't want to, Julia was right. Everything felt like a fog. A decision needed to be made, a date had to be set before she forgot. An unpleasant feeling had crept inside her. Luciana was afraid of this conversation with her father. Of course, she could just call him and tell him everything right now, but then there was a risk that she wouldn't be allowed back home. She needed to prepare herself thoroughly for an event that could end in a grand scandal. Listen, he's still your father. Even if he yells and makes a scene, he'll come around eventually. You're his only child, he can't just disappear. Just accept the fact that he's fixated on marrying you off to a wealthy guy. Today he has this idea, but tomorrow it will vanish like smoke from a hookah. Let him shout if that's what he needs, Julia said. With that, the conversation subsided. Luciana drove her friend home and felt completely drained herself. She needed to go home, take a shower, get a good night's sleep, and then be alone with her thoughts. Maybe it was worth going to the countryside first and then talk to her father? Luciana didn't know what the best course of action was, but one thing she knew for sure, the sooner she got it over with and told her father, the better. Luciana pulled up to her house, but disappointment immediately washed over her. There would be no rest and no sweet sleep in a soft bed. Eduardo's car was parked outside the house. Luciana already knew that a concert of feelings and confessions was about to begin. All these guys were the same, as Luciana had already told her father. Eduardo stood in the living room, his smile slightly stretched, holding an enormous bouquet of roses. Luciana refused the flowers. She just stood there, looking at the person who was currently ruining her life. Eduardo smiled, his face gleaming in the bright lights of the living room. He felt so out of place and alien that she wished he would disappear in an instant. It would be great if he could vanish with a snap of her fingers. Luciana, I want to formally invite you on a date. These flowers are as beautiful as you are. I behaved like a fool, so I want to apologize. I want us to meet at the most expensive restaurant in town, he said. I'm not going to see you anymore. I realized right away that you're someone I don't even want to communicate with. We are too different, fundamentally unsuited for each other, even for simple conversation. So please, leave me alone, Luciana said firmly. Why are you so stubborn? Any girl in this town would dream of having such a guy come to her, holding an expensive bouquet of roses. Or are you our pink princess? Daddy fulfills all your whims, so you don't need a husband? He asked with unpleasant undertones of passive aggression. Go to hell. Seriously, leave me alone. I don't like you, we are not a couple. I just want you to leave me alone, Luciana said decisively. She simply walked into her room, slammed the door shut, and locked it from the inside. Everything had become so unpleasant, so prickly. It felt as if she had swallowed a cactus. Luciana lay down on her bed and burst into tears. Even in her own home, she wasn't safe. Did her father give him the keys? Who had let him into the house? The next morning, Luciana took a shower, put on a warm robe, and returned to her room. She wanted to have breakfast there, but her father insisted she come downstairs to the kitchen. Luciana got herself ready, changed into a casual tracksuit, and went downstairs. She had no mood at all. Everything inside her felt constricted, forcing her to admit to her father that the whole idea had been foolish. She didn't want to upset her father or create a scene, but if he continued to insist that this person was the perfect match for her, she would still engage in a verbal altercation. Why do I hear rumors that you arranged a concert for that young man? Her father inquired. I arranged a concert? Me? I come to my own home, and there's some freak waiting for me who has no right to be here. He brings me flowers, sings songs like an idiot about how we just didn't understand each other from the beginning. I've already dated him, realized that this person is absolutely alien to me. It's as if we're from different planets. Luciana, is it so difficult for you to go on a date with him? Just visit the restaurant, have a nice dinner. What's the problem? The problem is that I don't want to, Luciana snapped. Her father slammed the table with an open palm. Luciana jumped in surprise, stared at him, but didn't wait for explanations. Why have you become so stubborn? Just like your mother. Haven't you grown tired of throwing tantrums like a little child? You're a grown woman. At your age, your mother was already married, and you'll choose some country bumpkin for yourself? Or will your choice be a city playboy who never leaves nightclubs? You girls have your heads filled with cotton. You won't find a decent guy for anything. I've found you a wonderful match, the perfect option. It's the perfect option for you and your business, Luciana retorted. Really? What option is perfect for you? Her father said with anger in his voice. To be left alone. Luciana yelled. The scandal she least wanted was growing, spreading like ivy on a battered wall. Luciana realized that she could hardly stop herself, and word by word, they argued again. Her father was throwing his threats around, which were worth nothing. Luciana stormed out of the house and decided not to do anything else. No more conversations until she calmed down. Luciana drove through the city in her car. The traffic coming towards her didn't concern her at all. She was angry, frustrated, and kept hitting the steering wheel. She was exhausted from her father's constant instructions and conditions. It felt as if he were doing everything to spite her. Damn car, damn Lalo. She yelled. Luciana couldn't contain her own anger. She turned on the music, trying to distract herself at least a little. She slammed the car door shut as soon as she got out. She had rented an apartment in the city. She wanted to stay there for a while. It was a place that only her friend knew about, and her father had no idea. Here, Luciana could truly feel safe, and no more Eduardos would find their way here. Luciana climbed the stairs, inserted the key into the door, swung it open, and froze immediately. The sounds were as if someone had deliberately put on a pornographic movie. When Luciana stormed into the bedroom, she was dumbfounded to see Eduardo and Julia there. Julia screamed, wrapped herself in the sheets, and started crying right away. Eduardo lazily started to put on his clothes. "Get out of here, both of you. What the hell are you even doing here?" "Julia!" Luciana shouted. She left the bedroom, feeling nauseated by all the smells. Her head was spinning from the realization that her friend had treated her even worse than her own father. Luciana loved this little rented apartment so much, and now she was disgusted by everything, even the books in the small shelf. Here, she could have felt at peace, not thinking about anything. She had given her keys to her friend only once, so she could spend the night after a fight with her boyfriend. Did she make a copy of the keys? The man entered the kitchen first. Eduardo was fastening his pants and looking at the girl mockingly. Luciana couldn't understand what else he wanted. "This is my apartment. I don't want to see you here anymore. If I find out you've been here, you'll be charged with illegal trespassing. I'm not going to play hide and seek with you. If I find out again that you've been here, I'll file a complaint. And if we're going to compete with money, trust me, I can have you arrested," Luciana responded rather harshly. She saw no point in finding a polite approach with him. He was not the kind of person she needed to be polite with. Eduardo immediately stopped smiling. Apparently, her stern tone had a much more intimidating effect on him than he expected. "You know, you have too much pride for such a young age," Eduardo said. "You know, you have too much arrogance for such a young age," Luciana replied in the same tone. "I suggested that you go on a date, talk to your father, did everything to make it go smoothly. Do you think I was thrilled about this forced marriage situation? We could have gotten married, but each of us would live our own life. On paper, there would be stamps. Everyone would benefit," the man said. "Everyone except me," Luciana said with a forced smile. Eduardo laughed. At this moment, Luciana wanted to grab a ladle and hit him so hard that there wouldn't be a trace left of his white teeth. She was angry with him, but more than anything, she was angry with herself for even allowing him to be here. One thing Luciana was sure of, she had made the right choice by refusing to go on a date with him. And even more so, she would never agree to this infamous marriage. "You won't escape anyway," Eduardo said, suddenly changing his tone. "What do you mean?" "I mean it directly. You're a helpless girl, you'll do whatever your father tells you. Even after all this, if he tells you to marry me, you'll agree. Maybe not right away. Maybe in a month or two, but you'll agree because he'll leave you penniless, and you won't survive like that. He'll set the conditions. At first, you'll pretend to be a princess, but then, when you've lived without your father's money, you'll quickly crawl back to him on your knees and agree to any terms. So, we'll definitely talk more about this," Eduardo said. He left the apartment, leaving behind an unpleasant musky scent. The perfume was expensive, but the smell was disgusting. Luciana sat at the table and waited for her friend to come out so they could discuss the situation that had unfolded. When Julia finally emerged, Luciana wanted to throw her out even without a conversation. She was the last person Luciana expected to stab her in the back. "How could you? I let you in here when you were in trouble and feeling bad. Your own mother nagged your brain, and you. I did everything for you, was always there for you, and you just brought that freak here. I don't care anymore. Sleep wherever you want and with whomever you want, but why him and in my apartment? Don't you realize how awful that is?" Luciana exclaimed indignantly. Julia cast her eyes down, staring at her own feet. She had finally gotten dressed, but her disheveled appearance irritated Luciana even more. Luciana rolled her eyes. Julia's appearance annoyed her even more. She not only wanted to put her friend in her place, but also receive some form of apology. Julia dropped tears onto the floor and remained silent. For some reason, she had never thought she was doing something wrong before, but now she suddenly burst into tears. Luciana shook her head in disbelief. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "If you don't leave right now, I won't communicate with you at all." In fact, I don't even know how to maintain a friendly relationship with you anymore. Julia, you're the last person I expected to betray me like this. My father is pressuring me into marriage, and you're sleeping with this guy, and in my apartment, of all places. I fell in love. Well, please forgive me. He's so perfect, well-off, confident, stubborn in the right sense. God, you don't even need him anyway. What's the difference? You still won't marry him, so why shouldn't I give it a try? Julia asked, tears in her eyes. And where should I take him? Home? Where Eugene is. I hope you have the sense to tell everything to Eugene before you agree to his proposal. The last thing I want to think about is that you have a fiancé waiting for you at home who has no idea what you're doing. I'm just shocked by you. Eduardo is just using you. He only needs me, and only for the sake of my father's connections. I hope someday you'll realize what you're getting yourself into. Julia simply left to get dressed and leave. Soon, she was standing in the corridor. Julia glanced sideways at her friend, as if trying to gauge her mood. But Luciana had no intention of talking to her about anything more. Perhaps they would reconcile someday, but right now, conversation was impossible. In love. Luciana couldn't believe that nonsense, especially knowing how Eduardo behaved. He had simply messed with her head to make fun of her. Luciana returned home only after a day, but another surprise awaited her there. Her father was waiting for her with prepared arguments. However, instead of having a calm conversation, they had another heated fight. Luciana felt that she couldn't stay in this house any longer. The only way forward for her was to go to her mother's house. Luciana began packing her things that same evening, informing her father that she was going to the village to spend some time alone. Somehow, Señor Rivas assumed that his daughter wanted to think about his proposal in solitude, even though she hadn't mentioned it. The man softened immediately, offered to help her pack, and even suggested hiring a driver to take her to the village. He wasn't thrilled that she was leaving, but he seized the opportunity, hoping that he could still reach his daughter. Early the next morning, Luciana brought down 2 suitcases. She hoped she might never return to this house. She took all the essentials, but it still felt insufficient. Her father, who was pacing nervously by her car, looked happy. Luciana suspected that even in this situation, her father wanted to manipulate it to his advantage. He saw no one around him as a human being, he used everyone for his own benefit. It's actually good that you're going to the village. You'll live alone, think things over. I believe this trip will be good for you. Maybe you'll understand what it's like to live without so much money. You're not a spendthrift like the daughters of my business partners, but, you know, I really only want the best for you, her father said. By forcing me into marriage? Luciana asked, fastening the suitcases in the trunk. You're being too dramatic about this. This is an excellent opportunity to unite parts of our business. Do you understand that you could have a great husband? Who is already sleeping with my friend? Thanks, Dad, you found me a great fiancé. But he comes with money, right? Luciana inquired. He just wanted to teach you a lesson so you would realize what you're losing. You know, it's like selling a bag of manure to someone who has no idea what to do with it, shoving it in their face, and repeating that they're losing out on something great, Luciana said. Her father rolled his eyes. Apparently, his confidence that this trip would benefit him was fading with each passing moment. Luciana got into the car. Señor Rivas approached the open window. He leaned on the door and looked into his daughter's eyes. I can be very harsh with you, as you well know. Right now, we are talking as equals so you understand that I'm on your side. It's beneficial for all of us right now, do you realize? I'm sorry that you're disappointed in him, but this is important for our business. Then you should have had 10 daughters, united all the businesses in the world, and then gone back to the Stone Age where women have no rights, Luciana snapped. She reversed the car. Her father leaned slightly to the right but managed to stay upright. Luciana drove away towards the village where her mother lived. The further she got from her father's mansion, the more at ease she felt. However, she had no idea that a series of events awaited her that would change her life completely. Senor Rivas arrived in the village much later than he had anticipated. He had hoped his daughter would return in a few days, but for 2 weeks she had been busy with herself and the house. He learned that she had given up on cleaning service and wasn't having any food delivered. He was shocked that it seemed like she didn't even need him anymore. What Senor Rivas loved most about his daughter was her dependence on him. However, Luciana quickly realized that her father used this as just another manipulation. On the day when her father called again and promised to come, Luciana wasn't counting on his arrival. To be honest, this person was more likely to promise to come but stay occupied with his business. Luciana left early in the morning and almost immediately heard the sound of a car. She knew it was her father, and she had a feeling that today he would actually come. When the car stopped, Senor Rivas got out with a wide smile. He had brought 3 large bags of expensive groceries, overseas vegetables and fruits, as he jokingly put it. Luciana calmly saw her father off, but he insisted on having lunch together. They sat in the gazebo, talking, but when her father started with his manipulation again, Luciana rolled her eyes. "I have a business proposal for you. You're so grown up and independent, so let's talk as 2 adults. First, we'll make a contract between us. If you want, we can specify everything down to the smallest detail. Then we can negotiate the rest of the terms. If you're worried that I'll leave you to fate, you're mistaken. You're my daughter. So you'll only leave me to fate if I don't meet your criteria, right?" Luciana asked. The man couldn't hold back any longer. His bald head was turning red. Luciana felt that the situation was about to get worse, but she was now prepared to stand her ground. She had a small financial cushion, remote work, and important things she had managed to take with her. If her father cut off her access to finances, so be it. She no longer wanted to bicker with him over trivial matters. This is becoming a farce. Can't you even listen to me properly now? Fine, speak. Thank you for your permission, dear, Senor Rivas said unpleasantly. I'll buy you an apartment in the city center, a 4-bedroom one. If you want, a 2-story one. I'll pay for any courses you desire. I'll also open a business for you to enjoy. Do you like these terms? But in return, I have to lie in bed with the man you've chosen for me. No. You know what? If you ever offer me that again, you are obligated to marry him. We have already decided everything. Oh, you've decided everything. Then go ahead and marry each other. They decide. I'll marry the first person I meet, got it? Luciana shouted. Her father lost his temper, slammed his fist on the table, and stormed off to his car. He got into the car and disappeared, leaving behind only a big cloud of dust. Luciana took a deep breath and forced herself to calm down. She had spent so much time calming down after that situation that she wouldn't allow herself to get worked up again. Luciana changed her clothes and decided to go fishing. It was a fine day today, the perfect time for simple rural activities. After a life of luxury in the city, the rustic simplicity seemed wonderfully beautiful to her. Luciana walked along the dusty road. Everyone around was busy, they greeted her, and sometimes waved their hands. Luciana could literally feel the friendliness of people who were not interested in her financial status. They were just friendly because they were good people. That's what Luciana liked about this place. Apparently, this was what also appealed to Luciana's mother, who often came here. Luciana stopped by a chestnut horse. The horse turned its head over the fence, stuck its head into a bucket, but found nothing interesting. Luciana burst into laughter, took an apple out of her pocket, which she intended to snack on by the river. The red-headed horse munched happily on the apple. "Do you like it?" asked Milicho, a limping guide who approached the horse and patted its neck. When Luciana saw him for the first time, she didn't pay much attention to him. He was a simple guy, smiling, but his limp was quite noticeable. "I've always dreamed of learning to ride, but I was always afraid to even get in the saddle," she said with a smile. "So get on now." Why wait? Milicho asked and laughed. Luciana froze for a moment. She thought he was joking, but Milicho was not joking at all. Come on, hop. I'll saddle him up and take the reins. Don't worry, he even takes kids for a ride like a crystal vase. Luciana decided to seize the opportunity. Milicho saddled the chestnut horse, set up a small wooden step for her. Luciana quickly got into the saddle but immediately grabbed the pommel. Milicho laughed, patted the horse's neck, handed Luciana the reins, and stepped back a bit. The horse slowly started to move in a circle. Then it shifted into a trot and Milicho explained how to ride. Luciana was terribly scared, but at the same time, she felt an unforgettable happiness. Luciana started attending regular training sessions every day. She enjoyed working with horses immensely, even surprising herself. On rainy days, she would come to clean the horses, scatter their feed, and sometimes help with throwing the manure out. On other days, she attended training sessions. Quickly, Luciana mastered the basics of riding. Though she sat somewhat unsteadily, she loved it with all her heart. The longer Luciana engaged in horseback riding, the more she fell in love with Miguel. Despite his disability, Milicho was a cheerful, kind guy. He looked at her with the devotion in his eyes, like a puppy. Quickly, a relationship blossomed between them, and locals started teasing them that a wedding was on the horizon. They also joked that the prince didn't come on a horse, he sent the horse for the bride. Miguel was a local tractor driver. Luciana often gathered her horse in the mornings and rode out to the fields to stretch her legs and watch her boyfriend at work. This life meant everything to her. Money no longer mattered. After the conversation with her father, he had indeed cut off her access to finances. He even blocked her mobile banking, so she couldn't receive a penny. However, Luciana didn't even let herself be upset about it. But one day, Luciana finally persuaded her father to come. Señor Rivas, completely satisfied, was sure his daughter had come to her senses. He was driving to the village, humming a tune to himself and singing along with the radio. His mood was simply fantastic. He would get her consent now. In a month, they would be married, and then they could do whatever they wanted, as long as the necessary paperwork was in place. Luciana, who was very nervous, didn't even suspect that her father was counting on her favor. What favor could even be discussed? When he arrived, Luciana sat her boyfriend down, waiting for her father to enter. She had set the table and was clapping her hands impatiently. Her hands were trembling with anticipation. Luciana knew she wouldn't be able to stand this for even another day. When her father entered, he stared at his daughter. "I want to introduce you to my F." "What? Did you really decide to marry the first person you meet? I thought you had finally made up your mind." "Yes, I made up my mind. Milicho and I want to get married, so I wanted to introduce you to him, and you keep interrupting me. Can't you just be happy for me?" The man didn't say anything. Señor Rivas stormed out of the house again, just like last time. Luciana breathed a sigh of relief. It was all over. Her father would never forgive her. But maybe that was for the best. She was tired of constantly being at his beck and call. Luciana felt foolish. Her head was pounding, and nausea crept up her throat. Because of nerves, she could spend weeks trying to recover. But this time, she came to herself by evening. Apparently, she was mentally prepared for her father not to agree to such a groom. "Don't get too upset," Miguel said. "For him, money is the only idol. I'm tired of explaining to him that I want a different life. I won't marry on his terms. If he doesn't understand me, then it's no longer my problem. I'm very tired, Milicho. I just want everything to be okay. What's the value of money anyway? Sure, you can get a different car, but we'll still be on wheels. Yes, you can buy an expensive shirt, and I can get one for $10, but in the end, we'll both be dressed. You know, I don't see any value in money. If we have money, great, and if not, well, it's not a big deal. We'll manage somehow ourselves, right?" We both work, so everything will be fine, Miguel said. His confidence seemed to transfer to her. She listened to him, willing to listen for hours. His voice calmed her. Milicho talked about how they would build a future together, and even if they were left without any financial support from her father, it wouldn't be a problem. When Luciana first met Milicho's mother, she was very afraid. She literally trembled, awaiting the mother's decision. She feared that this rural woman would outright reject a city bride for her son. However, Senora Lucero turned out to be a very kind person. She welcomed her future daughter-in-law and rejoiced in her every visit. They made dumplings and pies together, spending hours preparing preserves for the winter. Their connection was so strong it felt like they were best friends. Julia visited her friend's village only a few months after the incident in the apartment. They had spoken on the phone a few times, and Luciana hugged her, welcomed her into the gazebo, and set the table. Julia was glad that Luciana was no longer holding a grudge against her. I'm ashamed of how I acted back then. You know, we're still together. He doesn't want to tell anyone, and I'm ashamed that we're hiding like mice, she said. On the other hand, maybe we should wait for a while? I know you don't trust him, but I really want everything to work out. You know, I'm ashamed of myself. Julia's words were a bit scattered. It seemed as though she could hardly align her own thoughts. Luciana warmly embraced her friend. Let them do whatever they wanted, as long as it didn't concern her. Our entire blogosphere is buzzing about your fight with your father. People have gone wild, some are on your side, while others condemn you. Of course, no one mentions the real reason. They just write that your father cut off his own daughter from the finances. Mostly, everyone says that your father will come around. He has so much money that he can provide for great-grandchildren, but he kicked his own daughter out, Julia said. It's actually good that no one knows the true reason. You know, it's so great here. Julia, the weather is amazing, and the horses are so beautiful. I've learned to ride, and I even go out to the fields. There's internet here, so I can work remotely. I've set up a garden and a greenhouse. Life is wonderful here. I want to get some chickens to make it even better, Luciana said. Julia looked at her friend with a smile. She had never seen Luciana so happy before. Have you really decided not to go to university? Don't you think your degree might come in handy someday? Julia asked. Oh, forget about that university. All I want right now is to work peacefully, live peacefully, and not have anyone bother me, Luciana replied. Julia smiled. She couldn't understand why Luciana had chosen this life over her previous one. She loved the hustle and bustle of the city, parties, and well-off guys. She couldn't fathom why Luciana had traded such a wonderful life for what she had now. But Julia didn't argue with her anymore. She wanted to maintain her relationship with her friend in any way possible. Julia promised to visit more often, but Luciana knew these visits would be infrequent. Senor Rivas was already aware that Julia had visited her friend. He questioned her, trying to do it gently. Julia honestly told him that Luciana was happy even without all that money. This greatly annoyed Senor Rivas. When he was sitting in the office with his friend, he couldn't help but bring up the topic again. Can you imagine? I cut her off completely, took everything away from her. This foolish girl finished some courses and now she works online. What can she earn that way? At most, 2,000. It's awful. I can't believe she's not backing down, Senor Rivas said. And what did you expect? Laughed Rodrigo Caballero. You wanted to force that guy on her as a husband. You even told her directly that you needed it for business. What a fool. No modern girl will marry just like that. They've become smarter. They don't need this marriage for nothing, Senor Caballero said. Senor Rivas threw up his hands. He absolutely did not expect that Rodrigo would be on his daughter's side. He got up and walked back and forth in his office, pacing it with his steps. Constantino, stop playing games already. She wants to marry a tractor driver, so be it. You have a good girl. She values money and is taking charge of her own life. Mine has squeezed every last drop out of me. She wants a fur coat, a new car every year, a new smartphone every month. I'm already sick of her demands. You have a wonderful daughter, and you're just pushing her away. You know what? What? Senor Rivas mocked, asking again. You're not getting any younger, Constantino. When she has children, you won't have any grandchildren. You'll just sit there waiting for your daughter to back down. Learn to love your child as she is. Senor Rivas softened a bit after these words. Over the next few days, he couldn't find peace. He thought that maybe it was time to make amends with his daughter. They hadn't spoken for over 2 months. Golden colors were gradually thickening on the street. Winter was coming soon, and she would be left in the village without any money. Senor Rivas wanted to seize this opportunity. He filled a portable fridge with meat. He planned to bring it to his daughter so that she could freeze it for winter. He wanted to talk to her a bit and then suggest reconciling. But so much time had passed already. What if his daughter didn't want to reconcile? Eduardo turned out to be a terrible partner, so he got rid of him. It was a good thing they didn't have to make him a part of their family. Eduardo's mask had fallen off, revealing what a terrible person he truly was. The guy had planned a scheme, not even afraid of being caught. And what would have happened next if his daughter had married him? Senor Rivas couldn't come to terms with the thought that he was wrong. He couldn't stand admitting he was wrong at all. Every time he had to apologize, it felt like he was turning himself inside out. He was driving to his daughter's, but as soon as he entered the village, he spotted her. Luciana was riding a black stallion across the field. He recognized her from afar, her slender shoulders, long chestnut hair tied in a braid. Senor Rivas took a deep breath. Luciana's mother loved horses immeasurably. She loved them so much that she was willing to do anything to get back in the saddle, hug the horse, and inhale the scent of the stables. And no tricks or bribes worked on her, so it's not surprising that her daughter inherited this quality. Sonora, can you tell me where Miguel Lucero lives? Senor Rivas asked. Milicho? He lives on Crafter Street. He's a good guy. He helped me just yesterday. Why do you ask? The woman inquired. My daughter wants to marry him, that's why I'm asking. Is this your daughter? The woman asked, staring at the expensive car of the man. It seems like you don't love your daughter too much. She's buying discounted groceries, and you're driving around in such a fancy car. It's not right abandoning your children. Senor Rivas couldn't stand being lectured about his life. He clenched his lips but didn't say anything. Milicho is a good guy, worthy, hardworking. He doesn't smoke, doesn't drink, helps unconditionally. He works on a tractor, catches fish, even sells fish in winter. He's like a rock. A loyal person, good. You should be happy your daughter chose such a man as her husband. They have the 16th house, and the roof is bright colored, the woman added. When Luciana put the stallion in the stable and decided to head home, she was in a great mood. She let 2 mares into the pasture, and then, tired, walked home. The morning was beautiful and sunny, but clouds were slowly rolling in from the north. Dad? Luciana asked, astonished. Her father was standing near the house, looking at his watch. The snow-white expensive car seemed out of place here, massive and cumbersome. Luciana looked at her father, then at the car, and gestured towards the house. With her approval, Senor Rivas entered the house. He was shifting from foot to foot, visibly nervous, twiddling his hat in his hand. Forgive me. I hurt you badly. I don't even know how to talk to you now, whether you'll forgive me at all. I'll forgive you, of course, if you stop trying to set me up with suitors, Luciana said, opening her arms for a hug. They embraced. Senor Rivas laughed with relief. A few minutes later, they were already sitting at the table. Luciana loaded the freezer with meat, happily thinking about the upcoming worry-free winter. Mother chose a good house for you. How did she know you'd come back? It's been standing here for so many years, but it still looks like new. Would you mind if I bring the guys over? Let them take a look at the house. If you decide to stay, at least let them fix it up before winter." Luciana nodded. It was nice to see that her father was communicating with her as he used to. It was pleasant to realize that he had finally decided to apologize, and there would be no more of those foolish conversations between them. "I'm ready to talk to your Miguel. I've asked the locals about him. They speak highly of him. Your friend Julia is going to marry Lalo. Are you aware?" The conversation about Eduardo was so unexpected, especially in the context of what had just been said, that Luciana froze for a moment. On one hand, she was very glad that her father wanted to talk to Milicho after all. On the other hand, it was strange to hear him say such things. "I almost got you married to an idiot. He could have ruined our business, or at least a large part of it. I look at myself in the mirror and can't believe it." A grown man with no brains, Senor Rivas laughed. "Why did Julia set you up with this marriage? You're great. From day one, you sensed what kind of person he was. But it's useless to explain it to her. She insists she's in love, charmed, and I didn't try to dissuade her. I'm tired of constantly covering for her when she gets into trouble. Julia is quite grown up now. Maybe she can make her own decisions and take responsibility for them. As for Lalo, if he doesn't find himself a sponsor, he'll quickly squander his father's fortune." Luciana shared her thoughts. "You know, I connected everything to you a week ago. All the accounts, all the cards, everything is active. I'll never do this to you again, even if you go against me," her father said. He lowered his head and then glanced at his daughter discreetly. Luciana was smiling in a peculiar way. She was a wonderful, kind child who had grown up a long time ago. He had accepted the fact that Luciana had chosen not to go to university and was ready to pay for anything she wanted, as long as it meant restoring their family. Rodrigo was right. There was so much money that it would last for generations, even if he stopped earning now. There was no need to create chaos out of nowhere. Honestly, Senor Rivas felt deeply ashamed of his behavior. His desire to prove his point had nearly destroyed his family, his daughter's life, and possibly even his business. "So, how did your Milicho end up with a limp?" Senor Rivas inquired. "It's an old story. He and his mother were still living in the city back then. Some reckless guys hit them at the crosswalk and fled. The police didn't even bother to investigate. Who knows why? But his mother didn't get hurt at all, and he had a complex fracture. The doctor couldn't fix it properly, so he ended up with a limp," Luciana said. "Did they get hit at the North Street crossing by any chance?" Senor Rivas suddenly asked with a trembling voice. "Yes, it was at North Street. Have you heard this story before? I looked it up on the internet recently, and there really wasn't much of an investigation," Luciana said, shrugging her shoulders. Senor Rivas's whole being turned cold. He felt like an absolute fool. His hands were shaking, and his face turned pale. Luciana stared at her father, frightened, waiting for him to say something. She didn't understand what was happening. "Let's go, take me to his mother." "Milicho works late, doesn't he?" her father asked. He spoke very slowly, carefully choosing his words, as if afraid to say too much. Luciana decided not to delay. She didn't know what was going on with her father. She put on her jacket and went outside. They walked past several houses, turned, and crossed the street. They arrived at the Lucero's house through a small alley. A beautiful middle-aged woman came out onto the porch. As soon as the man crossed the gate, he knelt in front of her. He kissed her palms, swearing that he had realized everything. Luciana and Senora Lucero were in complete shock. Neither of them understood what was happening. Luciana jumped in place when Miguel's voice sounded behind her. "For God's sake, forgive me. For God's sake." Senor Rivas begged. Only now did Luciana realize what was happening. She covered her mouth with her hands in horror, watching this situation unfold. Miguel was already standing next to his mother, hugging her by the shoulder. Then Senor Rivas confessed that all these years he had been eaten alive by guilt from within. The pangs of conscience were sometimes so heavy that he couldn't sleep for several days. So many years had passed, but he continued to blame himself. It was he and his friend who had hit them that day. His friend was behind the wheel. He wanted to go back and confess, but when he arrived at the scene in a taxi to do so, no one was there. He assumed they had perished but chickened out from going to the police. That was all so many years ago. To his surprise, Senora Lucero forgave him quite quickly. She simply mentioned that everyone makes mistakes in life, and things happen. Miguel also decided to forgive him. They were sitting in the kitchen, talking, within a few minutes. Senor Rivas noticed that Senora Lucero and Miguel's house was falling apart. The house was so old and worn down by life that no amount of repairs could help it anymore. Plus, the Luceros lived very modestly. That evening, Senor Rivas was getting ready to go home. There was no way to persuade him to stay any longer. He looked at his daughter with an indescribable sense of guilt. He had ruined her life, it seemed. He had turned her husband into a disabled man. Is there really no way to fix this? Senor Rivas asked. I looked into it. Only one doctor in Capital takes on such cases. The cost there is astronomical. We started saving money for it, Luciana said. She was afraid to mention that they now had enough money to comfortably afford the operation. Everything felt strange and inappropriate. Her father and she were talking to each other, but it seemed like the family bond between them had been severed during these long months. Luciana understood that everything would gradually get back to normal. It wasn't the first time they had argued for an extended period, but it was the first time her father had come to make amends first. Now he truly realized what he was doing. Talk to Julia. I'll talk to her tomorrow, Luciana said. Senor Rivas kissed his daughter on the cheek, then walked to his car. Soon, the yard was empty. Luciana was left alone. She felt disappointment, but also a pleasant sense of forgiveness. Everything was falling into place wonderfully, considering that her father wouldn't come up with anything like this again. But Luciana couldn't be sure of that. The next day, Luciana had to go to the city. The documents she had ordered through a website were ready. She had a foreboding of the conversation she was about to have with her friend. In reality, Luciana only wanted one thing, for Julia to see for herself the kind of person she had chosen to marry. Luciana knew that this person couldn't be trusted. He was one of those who would stab you in the back while speaking pleasant words to your face. His hypocrisy extended to sociopathy. Eduardo seemed like a good person, but in reality, he was rotten. Julia didn't even suspect what the conversation would be about. She was simply waiting for her friend to come over. When Luciana entered Julia's apartment, many things had changed. The apartment looked deserted. Most of the things that belonged to Eugene had disappeared. Julia knew that they would eventually part ways, but she didn't expect it to happen in such a terrible conflict. After their breakup, Luciana had occasional communication with Eugene, and he was clearly not happy with the situation. But even Eugene, an interested party, had immediately told his beloved that she had chosen a repulsive person to spend her life with. I'm so glad you came. I think we have something to discuss. You made up with your father. That's good. You're getting married to a good guy, at least that's what you say. Maybe everything is really going well for you, Julia said. She placed several boxes of sushi rolls on the table. The doorbell rang. Julia thought it was Eduardo. She hurried to the window to see his car, but it wasn't there. Julia looked somewhat hesitantly at Luciana and then headed towards the front door. But when she opened it, she didn't recognize the woman standing in front of her. Victoria stood there, wearing an expensive coat with a fur collar. When you look at such women, you immediately understand that they live more than comfortably. Can I come in? Victoria asked. Without waiting for a response, the woman stepped over the threshold. Julia took a step back, unable to refuse her. The unfamiliar woman exuded an aura of confidence and prosperity. Luciana got up and went into the hallway. "So, you're Senor Rivas's daughter, right?" "I knew your mother. You resemble her very much," Victoria said. For some reason, Luciana thought that she had seen this woman before. Her black hair cascaded in soft waves, almost detaching her from details. The woman had no intention of taking off her expensive coat and boots. She remained standing in the hallway, closing the door behind her to prevent the neighbors from hearing any gossip. Julia stepped back but immediately bumped into her friend, who stood behind her. Luciana felt more courageous with her friend by her side. "My name is Victoria Benavente. I am Eduardo's wife, or rather, his ex-wife," she said in one breath. Luciana immediately remembered where she had seen this face before. Her mother had once taken her to a music school, and that's where she had first seen Victoria. Other kids used to make fun of her surname, calling her Countess Benavente. Those words immediately surfaced in Luciana's mind. Eduardo, the man you consider a wonderful, wealthy groom, is actually broke. He has debts of over 10 million. He wants to marry you to sneak in a prenuptial agreement and then pass on the debts to you or offload most of them onto you. I married him because I fell for the beautiful picture and didn't have time to see what lurked behind it. He married me only to live well off money, without doing anything." Luciana suddenly felt a weight lifted off her chest. Today, she had come to convince Julia not to marry this man, but the situation had taken a surprising turn. Victoria didn't even raise an eyebrow. She looked at the two young women, shifting her gaze between them. "He uses women to live comfortably. And you're only needed by him to take on his debts. He will ruin your life, girl. Of course, you can choose not to believe me, but take a look at this." Victoria handed Luciana her phone. Even over her friend's shoulder, Luciana could see the text messages. Eduardo was begging Victoria to mend their relationship, swearing that nothing bad would happen anymore. What was most frightening was that the messages were dated yesterday. Julia was even more stunned by what was happening. Victoria stood there for a few minutes. She didn't wait for a response and simply left the apartment, leaving behind only the trail of expensive perfume. Julia first froze and then suddenly stared at Luciana. "You came here to convince me not to get married, right?" Julia asked directly. "Yes, my father told me that he's a rotten person. He was planning a whole scheme, a hostile takeover, and a direct one. He left his own mother with no money, and she passed away a long time ago. There's a whole trail of trouble following him." "I was afraid you wouldn't listen to me," Luciana said. Julia immediately called Eduardo right from the doorway and told him that the engagement was off, that there was nothing between them anymore. Eduardo poured a heap of insults onto her, but Julia didn't listen any further. She ended the call, waving her hand at the phone. They sat at the table, drinking wine and chatting. Luciana hoped that Julia would still find her happiness, and she felt sorry for tearing apart such a strong relationship that Julia had with Eugene. Luciana only returned home the next day, deciding to stay overnight at her friend's place. Miguel rushed to her literally a couple of hours after he saw her car on the outskirts of the village. "Your father." Miguel gasped. He clearly rushed here to deliver the news as quickly as possible. Luciana took the documents that were in Miguel's hands. She sat there, staring at the text printed on the pristine white paper. The round blue seal left at the very bottom confirmed that the documents were authentic. Senor Rivas had arranged with a doctor for the surgery, fully covering the cost of the surgery itself, rehabilitation, and a stay in an expensive ward. To say that Luciana and Miguel were happy and shocked at the same time would be an understatement. They laughed, cried, hugged each other, and congratulated themselves that all the suffering would soon come to an end. Miguel couldn't even imagine a life without pain. Who would have thought that fate would bring him back to the person who had made him disabled in the first place? You know, he bought a house for Mother. Here, in the center, a good, solid house. I'm a man, but I was moved to tears. Mom cried. She was smoothing out that house, saying that fate had shown mercy. We thought we would live in that house until only the walls remained. Whether you fix it or not, it doesn't matter, Miguel said. Luciana was glad that her father had decided to make such a gesture. They spent the evening together, watching a TV series, laughing, and enjoying baked apples. Luciana was happy that Miguel's and his mother's lives were finally improving. The next morning, they received a phone call. Julia informed them that Eduardo had been taken in by the police. Discrepancies were found in his tax documents, which led to further investigations. It turned out that Victoria was not even aware that her ex-husband's debts had multiplied several times. Luciana was pleased that the situation was unfolding this way. Months passed. Miguel recovered, and he could now walk without a limp. He had to practically learn to walk again, but he was happy and willing to endure any pain as long as everything was getting better. In the spring, he walked down the aisle without a limp. They had a grand wedding, one that the entire village attended. Senor Rivas spared no expense, throwing a real celebration. There was a show, a concert, and even fireworks that lit up the sky with beautiful patterns, leaving a lasting memory for the villagers. The wedding was truly a hit. Even several weeks later, the locals continued to talk about how great the celebration had been. Luciana was happy to have married a man she truly loved. Miguel's mother seemed to have a new lease on life, now that she had a home of her own. She became livelier and more cheerful, and she experienced genuine happiness knowing that her son had married such a wonderful woman. On the day Luciana was going to the city with Miguel, her hands were trembling. She couldn't find her place, constantly nervous, fidgeting with her hands. When Luciana was anxious, she almost couldn't control her hand movements. She could either emotionally recount something while gesticulating actively or put an item on an unknown shelf, only to forget about it later. So, Luciana tried to stay as far away from the phone, charger, and items they planned to take with them as possible. When Miguel finally managed to get her into the car, Luciana calmed down a little. The day had been nerve-wracking from the start, and now she had to talk to her father and break the news to him. Do you think he'll be happy about it? Well, should he be upset about it? Miguel laughed. Luciana, you're overthinking this too much. You understand that the situation is progressing naturally. Everything is going as it should. You have nothing to worry about. Everything will be fine, as always, his voice reassured her. The car moved slowly along the road, occasionally overtaking other vehicles. Fine rain was falling, and heavy leaden clouds covered the entire sky. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, and then a downpour began. Maybe we should go another day? You've become superstitious, just like all the villagers, Miguel chuckled warmly. He didn't turn the car around, and they continued on their way to the city. Luciana felt increasingly distracted until she found herself in her father's house. Strangely, this was now truly her father's house, not her own. She came here as if visiting. It was strange to think that she had lived here for so many years, considering this place her home. They sat at the table. Senor Rivas could see that his daughter was very nervous, but he didn't rush her with her story. When she called and said she was coming unexpectedly, he immediately understood that something had happened. Luciana deliberately handed the housekeeper a box to take care of everything. The woman entered the room, holding a tray. She placed the dish in front of Senor Rivas. Inside was an ultrasound image. For a moment, Constantino sat there, looking closely at the small black and white image, at the documents, and the doctor's report. He simply stared, as if fixed on one point, not fully comprehending what was happening. Then suddenly, he shouted, jumped up from his seat, clapped his hands. He shook Miguel's hand, hugged and kissed his daughter, literally jumping up and down like a child. I'll be a grandpa. I'm going to be a grandpa. He shouted, overwhelmed with joy. You'll be a grandpa twice, Dad. We're having twins, Luciana said, but her voice carried more of her own worry. What a blessing, my dear. Lord, what a blessing. We'll have not just one but two gifts from above. God loves you so much, my girl, what a blessing. Senor Rivas repeated. Luciana relaxed in an instant. How could she ever think that her father wouldn't be thrilled with such news? He had always said it was better to have children later in life. Maybe that's why she had been so worried. But now he was so happy that all doubts were gone. Luciana cried tears of joy, and now both her father and Miguel were comforting her. The birth went wonderfully, even better than Luciana had expected. She gave birth to 2 sons. Now, the grandfather often came to visit his grandsons, bringing gifts. They often gathered as a family around the table, forgetting all the past grievances. They had the greatest happiness, a happy family.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.